Let's talk about metal. No, not that kind. This kind. Yeah, okay. Now let's make an album cover for that. Hello and welcome to Breath of Life Development. My name is Josh Foreman. And hey, before you scamper away because you're not particularly enthusiastic about this aesthetic of music, this is not a video about death metal, despite that intro there. No, this is just about the creative process, the endeavor of making a piece of art for a client and seeing the process from start to finish, the concepting, the several false starts and dead ends that I had to go through. And I think this video is really fun. It touches on a whole lot of different processes, materials, and techniques. And I think any creative person can get some fun stuff out of this. So I encourage you to just maybe make yourself a soothing cup of chamomile tea, put on some fuzzy bunny slippers, and sit back and enjoy. So the client had a very specific idea in mind. They wanted me to basically make a 3D version of this graphic image that they had used in the past. And that brought with it all sorts of interesting challenges, which required all sorts of concepting. So I did a lot of Photoshop mock-ups, very rough ideas, and presented these options to them, as well as figure out where the band name was going to go, where the album title would be. So you throw stuff at the wall and you see what sticks. In the end, what the client really liked was the idea of just keeping it really subtle and putting the logo on the scalpel itself. So at first I made some prototype scalpels out of real-world materials, and halfway through decided, you know what, I should really put my new 3D printer through its paces and see how useful it could be. So I modeled these props in ZBrush on my computer and 3D printed them. This is the program that most artists use to make all the special effects you see in movies and characters that you see in video games and such. And this is how they all got laid out, all the pieces that I would need to print. All those little lines you see there are the support rods that are necessary for when it prints out. Now, I didn't have any footage of the snake itself being printed, so you'll just have to settle for this Scola instead, but take my word for it. It was printed on this machine. Now, I did a couple tests. There are a variety of resins that you can 3D print in, and I wanted to see what would be the most flexible for these thin little bits so they wouldn't break as I'm working with them. And I ended up using this cool gray material. You can see these little lines there. These are the print lines that come about from the different layers being printed as it goes. Eventually that'll be a thing of the past, but in today's technology it's still a factor to consider. And I removed the little rib cages from their sprues, which reminded me a lot of when you're molding and casting. A lot of the same skills transferred, so that was nice. And I made the jaw hinged specifically so that I could adjust it per the client's request. I wasn't sure how much he wanted the mouth open or not. Yeah, you can see there's one of the prototype scalpels I started with, but in the meantime, I'm just using it to measure out the proportions and stuff. And I had this idea for making the snake skeleton, the spine, just by stringing these together like beads. Now I have to sand off the little nubs that are left over when you remove the support structures. And here's a really good close-up of these stair-steppies that I need to also get rid of. And once I was happy with where the mouth was, I superglued it in place. Now I went and I took the graphic image that I was working off of and just decided to make a 1-to-1 proportioned sculpture for the background so it could look like, I was imagining like an old hospital wall or floor of some sort. So I wanted to do a kind of cold concrete look. And I just did that by plastering over some styrofoam. And I really wanted to lean into the dimensionality as much as possible with the wall piece here because, I mean, if it's going to be an actual 3D prop, you might as well take the biggest advantage of that. So I wanted to make the graphic line there embedded in the concrete. Now here I'm using a product called Freeform Air to smooth over the styrofoam texture on the side and help strengthen it as well. And then I just set this little part that I cut out back into place. And created the bevel with my fingers. Now I found that my fingers weren't doing a great job at the bevel, so I cut a piece of foam core to the shape that I needed and used that to kind of dig a trench in there and get the bevel perfect. Because my 3D printer is not very large, I had to print this scalpel in 3 different pieces, and it's not very precise either, so I ended up with these seams that I had to patch over. This ended up taking a long time because this is a very flat, smooth surface. Any little ripples really showed up, so I had to spend a lot of time patching and sanding over these seams. For any die-hard Carcass fans out there who want some behind-the-scenes info, little trivia here, the 7 is because this is their 7th album. 1985, I believe, was the year that the band officially started. Yeah, see, the seam went right through the letters, so it required a lot of work to paste over that. Here I'm using a rubbery nubbery tool to help smooth it out. And I created the spine in several segments so it would be easy to wrap around and attach and detach the pieces as I needed. I'm using this really cool clamp system. It's very helpful for posing. And I was trying to make sure that I followed the proportions pretty well, like where it wrapped around the scalpel and how far it stood proud from it. After I got that in place, I started super gluing the things into place. Not super hard, but enough that they would stay put. And in goes the tongue. And no, it doesn't make sense for a skeleton snake to have a tongue. But who asked you? Alright, I'm using steel stick here to really affix things exactly where I want them to strengthen up the spine. Now to get that really cool weathered chipped paint inside the little trench that I have in the cement, I experimented with a couple different substances. This is water putty, and I thought if I dyed that, mixed it into a little trough and then cracked it, maybe that would give me a similar effect. Unfortunately, it did not stick to the bottom at all, so it just became these little rocky chunks. Next I tried to use some gesso. Can you guesso how that went? Not great is the answer. It turned into just this sludge that I was not particularly happy with. So next I tried some resin, and we'll get back to that and see how that turned out. Now I started putting in kind of the remains of some desiccated muscle and skin tissue all over it. I thought that would give it a pretty interesting look. These little fiddly tail bits were pretty interesting to work with. At the end, I decided to just sculpt some with some epoxy clay. I also put a number along the blade, and that number is a reference to a song that has a string of seemingly random numbers. I just wanted to reference that. I thought that was fun. And at this point, I had everything pretty much in place and base coated. And so I made sure to, I was always checking in to make sure that they were happy with the direction it was going. And yeah, they really liked it. So it was great time to figure out the rest. getting back to that flesh idea, you know, I ran it past the client and they were happy for me to try it out. I did a Photoshop test first to make sure. And when they approved it, I just went with it. So all I'm doing here is mixing toilet paper in with gray paint, turning it into kind of a pulp and smearing it around. And then I tried it with Mod Podge and that worked pretty much the same. Just Mod Podge and gray paint. Kind of fiddly to work with, but it was still fun. I even got into sculpting some tendons and such with it. I also used hot glue for some of the little stretchy bits. Use that as an anchor to put the tissue around. Sometimes you just gotta boop the nose of your sculpture, you know how it is. All right, now I wanted to make this concrete background look nice and weathered. So I'm just putting some inks into water and spattering it on there. The primer that I used was a little too shiny, so the paint didn't really soak in as well as I liked, but I just kept working at it. Now, after giving it a quick brown base coat with spray paint, I went ahead and gave them a bath in Quick Shade. This is a varnish that seeps into the cracks, makes it darker in the cracks. Really emphasizes the details. I'm just wicking away some of the parts where the puddles were getting too intense. And patting off the high surfaces. Now for the scalpel, I tried a couple different techniques. I wanted the handle to be a bit more used looking, more like iron. Less like polished steel. And more like regular steel, I guess you can say. So I used AK True Metal. This is a wax-based paint. And it works really well for this purpose. It really makes the edges, the highlights on the edges pop really well, but also lets some of the darkness in the crevices help enunciate. Now for the blade, I wanted it to be very shiny, so I just piled on the silver spray paint. So none of my techniques that I was hoping to work for the cracked paint ended up working, so I just decided to kind of draw them on. I've got this paint pen that I thought might be helpful, and it was all right. It didn't give me the depth that I really wanted though. And on to highlighting. I'm just dry brushing with some ivory over the bony parts. Always being sure to start on the back where no one's going to see the piece to make sure that it's working for me. And now painting the kind of rotten tissue with a brown. And now going over the whole thing with a shade. This is a Citadel shade called Seraphim Sepia. And then some more touch-ups with just regular burnt umber. Any places where I missed with the other paint. I always get too caught up in the details that no one will notice. But you know, it makes me happy, so. Finally, I decided this two-dimensional ink on here wasn't going to cut it, so I decided to use some epoxy clay and make actual flaky chips to go on there. So before mounting, I made sure that it would fit into place, and then I had to figure out how to do the blood spatter on the background there. I had this idea to make that veiny pattern by using hot glue. I figured if I made these veiny shapes and then spattered the paint over it, when I removed the hot glue, it would leave that negative space like that. I'm using some string that I've torn into pieces to make the really small parts. And I did a ring around it just so I could pick the whole thing up off of this parchment paper. And use it like a mask, just like that. Now, in retrospect, this was not the best idea. I should have used a latex that I could just paint on the surface, because as you'll see, after spattering the paint on there as thick as I did, it seeped under almost everywhere. Yeah, so not the best. A little bit of a setback here. I had to go in by hand and repaint a lot of those. I sprayed the same primer that I used on the background into the cap and just dipped my paintbrush directly in that to make sure it matched the background perfectly. Alright, and now it's time for the final mounting process, using some epoxy to put these steel dowels in place. I guess they're brass. Just painted them black. And then it was time for photography. And this is where I took a whole lot of different lighting techniques and ideas and just threw everything at the wall again. Showed it to him and said, hey, which of these do you think is coolest? We ended up doing kind of some combination of things. But this is how it ended up. So yeah, I had a lot of fun kind of poking around and figuring out how to make a good Carcass looking material. This could be applied to lots of things. Halloween decorations, horror stuff, just monster design in general. And hey, look, you can buy it on the website today. Go buy it. If you like death metal. How many polymer clay sculptors like death metal? I'll bet it's like 2%, maybe 3. Let me know in the comments if you like death metal. I'm curious. So that is how I made an album cover for the band Carcass. Now, they reached out to me after seeing the album covers that I did for the band Demon Hunter a year or so ago. They really liked those and thought, hey, we should have an album cover like that. And if you're interested in seeing the process behind making these guys, go to my links. You understand links. Do the links. Anyway, this was a great fun project. I really enjoyed it. It took me in all sorts of unexpected directions. I really don't think, because I've only done a couple professional album covers, I do not think this process is typical at all. I don't think Taylor Swift's album covers were done like this. I don't know, I haven't looked recently. But anyway, the point being that, when you see me do a project, you're gonna see my weird take on it, right? Do not think of this as an industry standard. I do my professional work weird, I do my personal life weird, everything about me is weird, and that's fine. It's just fine. It's fine. Anyway, thank you so much to my beautiful patrons. If these guys support my weirdness, you guys can support my weirdness with them, or you can just observe my weirdness on all the various socials. There's the Facema books, and the tweeters, and the Discordias. What else is there? There's Twitch. I Twitch stream all the time. You guys should check that out. It's really fun. It's a good time. We enjoy each other's weirdnesses. And there's nothing better than sitting around with a bunch of weird people enjoying each other's weirdness, in my opinion. I mean, there's probably something better than it, but I can't think of what that is right now. But that's probably because I'm weird. Huh.